So how does Paul define spiritual adulthood and spiritual infancy? Well, Paul says that spiritual maturity is Christ-likeness. To be like Jesus Christ is to be spiritually mature. That makes sense, right? There has never been any person who was more mature spiritually than Jesus Christ. He is the standard, the measure of spiritual maturity. And so I think the best, compact, concise definition of Christ's character, of his spiritual maturity, is the fruit of the Spirit passage in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. These are the types of things, the measurements of spiritual maturity. And Paul says in verse 13 that spiritual maturity in a church body will be demonstrated by unity. And the source of spiritual maturity is your and my relationship with God. Spiritual immaturity, on the other hand, Paul compares to being like a baby. And babies are unstable. They cannot make up their own minds. And they always change. One minute they want their bottle, the next minute they want to sleep. One minute they want the cupcake, the next minute they want the cookie. Always changing. And so are immature Christians. We're being carried with the winds of doctrine to and fro, and we're always changing our minds. We're very unstable. This is spiritual immaturity. So why do spiritual gifts benefit the church? How do spiritual gifts help you and me to grow spiritually? I think the best way to answer this question is simply to try to imagine a church without spiritual gifts. What would this church be like without spiritual gifts? What would it be like if there were no teachers to teach the Word of God here in this pulpit on Sunday morning, or to teach the children, the teenagers, the young adults on Sundays and throughout the weeks? What would it be like if there were no teachers? What would it be like if there were no pastors? No one that would sit down with you and hear you out and pray with you and comfort you with the Scriptures. If there were no number for you to call when you were sick. If there was no one to take care of the sick in the congregation. If there was no one to pray. How big would this congregation be if nobody invited anyone to the services? If nobody went out into the world and shared the gospel? What kind of testimony would this church have in the world if no one went out and served the sick and worked hard and honorably and had children and was a loving father and a good husband, a good wife, a good mother? What would the church be like without any spiritual gifts? I'll tell you what, we wouldn't even be a church. There would just be a sorry group of people here, some type of weird social club. And so spiritual gifts are imperative for the spiritual growth of the church. Now I've got to hurry my way through my last point. My last point is how? Practical. How can I use my spiritual gifts? This is the subject of verses 15 and 16. I'm going to read verses 15 and 16 to you. But speaking the truth in love, you may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. So Paul gives two answers to this question. How can we use our spiritual gifts? Paul says, first of all, every member ministry, every Christian ministering according to their individual spiritual gifts. And second of all, every member ministering in love. That we would practice our spiritual gifts, and that we would practice our spiritual gifts in love, with Christian love. So the first key to effectiveness, to effective ministry, is that as many people in the church as possible would be using their spiritual gifts. And I love the New Living Translation. of verse 16. Verse 16 is, perhaps you notice, it's a bit difficult to understand. Let me read the New Living Translation. Paul says, Christ makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow, so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. I like that. As each part, each member in this body, in this church, does its own special work. It has to do with your spiritual gifts. It helps the others grow. And so collectively, corporately, we all help each other grow to be more Christ-like for the glory of God and for the growth of the church in the world. And so the health of the church is imperative, is dependent on you and me serving according to our spiritual gifts. A home Bible study group met together one night to talk about the subject of spiritual gifts. And right as they were about to start, Brenda dropped her cup, her coffee cup. And it broke and spilled coffee all over the floor. Each group member responded differently. One person gave advice and saying, next time, if you'll just put your cup on the coffee table, that won't happen again. Well, he was the teacher in the group. Another person began to delegate tasks. Bill, you go find the mop. Sally, could you go help him with a towel? This person was the administrator. Bill, who had the gift of service, hurried to get the mop. And Sally, who had the gift of helps, followed Bill and said, I'll help you. Another person told Brenda, we all make mistakes, so don't let it get you down. He had the gift of exhortation. Another person put her arm around Brenda, patted her on the back, and said, oh, I'm so sorry this happened. I feel so badly for you. She had the gift of mercy. And finally, another person shouted out, I'll buy a new set of coffee mugs to replace the broken one. He had the gift of giving. Yeah, it's a rather corny example, but I think it's a good picture. It's a good picture of each person using that which they have, and together, collectively, we solve problems together. We help to clean up the mess which sin has made in this church, in our lives, and in the world, together. Well, not only should every member minister, but every member must minister in love. The gifts are futile. Nothing, Paul says, if they are not used in love. And that's why Paul emphasizes love in verses 15 and 16. Perhaps you notice that Paul begins verse 15 in love, saying, speaking the truth in love. That's the beginning of verse 15. And he ends verse 16 with the subject of love again. The body edifying itself in love. So the passage 15 and 16 begin and end with love. And whenever Paul talks about spiritual gifts and using your spiritual gifts in the church, he talks about love. He's careful to caution the church to practice love, lest pride or selfishness creep in when we use our spiritual gifts. In Romans 12, verses 9 and 10, after listing some of the spiritual gifts, Paul exhorts the church to have genuine, affectionate, brotherly love towards one another. 1 Corinthians is the best example. Most of us are familiar with the famous love chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And this is 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is right in between chapters 12 and 14, in which Paul discusses the topic of spiritual gifts. And so Paul is very careful to talk about love when it comes to spiritual gifts. How does the famous love chapter 13, 1 Corinthians 13, begin? Paul talks about the gifts. Though I speak with tongues of men and of angels, that's the gift of tongues, but have not love, he says, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. I've just become noise. It's just noise. He says, and though I have the gift of prophecy, understand all mysteries, and have all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I can remove mountains. So Paul lists 4 spiritual gifts here. Prophecy, knowledge, wisdom, and faith. Though I have these 4 gifts, he says, but have not love, I am nothing. Starting to get the point? Paul ends then saying, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, 2 more gifts, the gift of giving and the gift of mercy, but have not love, profits me nothing. Have you ever wondered, why is love so important? Why is it so important to minister in love? Well, who is God? Who is the God we serve? God is love, said John. His nature is love. So, isn't that a contradiction in terms? If we are ministering spiritual gifts, ministering with our spiritual gifts to one another, and we do not do it in love, and yet we're trying to help each other to grow spiritually, to become more like God, to become more like Jesus, to become more loving, but we are not loving ourselves, that's why it's nothing. It will not profit us anything. The end goal is Christ-likeness. The end goal of spiritual gifts is godliness. The end goal of spiritual gifts is genuine, authentic love. I'm going to close with a powerful example. And I know that many of you have, all of us, I think, know at least one person who has suffered. But I'm going to share this example anyway. Namely, there's a name. We have a name for cells in the human body which do not do their job. We have a name for cells where certain parts of the cell begin to break down and to stop doing their job. You know what the name is for these cells? The name is cancer. When cancer cells begin to reproduce, to multiply themselves throughout the body, and the body breaks down, and this causes death. The second leading cause of death in the United States today is cancer. I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm trying to get you to understand the seriousness of this matter. It's not a game. We're talking about spiritual gifts. We're talking about eternity. We're talking about life and death here. This is serious. People are dying out there in the world. Christians are leaving the church. Your gifts, your spiritual gifts are wanted in this church because the health and the growth of this church is dependent on you and on me ministering our gifts and ministering in love. And so I'd like to challenge you today to take some time after the service, spend some time in prayer, and ask God, what are my spiritual gifts, God? Where have you gifted me? And take a personal inventory. And if you know your spiritual gifts, ask God. Take some time this morning and ask God, Lord, am I using my spiritual gifts in this body? How can I use my spiritual gifts even more, to an even greater capacity? Take some time thinking, talking with God about spiritual gifts. Your spiritual gifts are wanted in this church. Make sure you don't leave here today without doing something about that.